Hello, this is Brooks Whittington with halfwheel.com. Today we're taking a look at the XIKAR 10mm punch cutter. Now this is one of three new cutters that XIKAR introduced during last year's PCA convention and trade show. And as the name indicates, it's a 10mm punch cutter with a singular blade. However, it does have a couple of really interesting, relatively unique design elements included within it that kind of make it stand out from the crowd of other punch cutters on the market. We'll get to those in just a second. Now, there are 4 different colorways of this 10mm punch cutter, all of which retail for the same price of $64.99. There's a bronze, which this is, a gold, a gunmetal, and silver. Now, this does have a 10mm blade, as I mentioned, and it extends and retracts via this twisting motion of the exterior casing, as you see here. And so you just basically pick it up and twist this part, and it comes right, the blade comes right out. Now, one of the interesting elements about this that may not be the same with a number of other punch cutters on the market is this owl, that's A-W-L, that extends from the blade, which you see right here. And what that is it's a centering point that allows the user to center the cutter before piercing the cap, putting the blade right in the middle of the cap. And it, works like a charm in terms of that. I'll get to that in just a second. Now, the other interesting thing about this cutter is the fact that it has 2 different cutting depths. And it gives the user more flexibility when it comes to how loose or how tight the draws are going to be. In order to actually get to that second depth, this is the standard depth here. And then you basically just keep twisting that piece of the cutter, and it gets to goes to double the depth of the first one. The owl, as you see, sticks right out of there, and it will basically retract the same way. You just go in the opposite direction, and that blade goes right back in. Now, in addition to both of those things, there is the fact that it has a key ring on the end of it, which I used extensively, and it works like a charm. And the body exterior is made of aluminum alloy, while the blade and the center owl are made of stainless steel. The cutter weighs 2.18 ounces while measuring 2.48 inches long when the blade is retracted, like so, and 2.65 inches long when the blade is fully extended, thusly. Now, it's 0.8 inches at its widest point from here to here and 0.29 inches at both ends. All right, now it's time to cut some cigars. So the process of using a punch cutter, any punch cutter, is relatively simple. However, it's not something that you actually want to rush in any way. And the reason is because that tobacco is fragile, shocker I know, and that you want to make sure that the cap is not damaged in any way as you're actually pulling that tobacco out of the actual cap. But you can see that as long as you go slowly and make sure that you're doing exactly what you need to do in terms of the actual process, that you can actually get a really, really good cut. And a clean cut, too. So one of the cool things, as you can see as I pull that out, is that that cap that was just there that you cut out falls right out when you close the blade in, when you retract the blade. So the process, as I mentioned, is fairly simple, and this XIKAR 10mm punch cutter is relatively simple to use as well. You basically pick it up, you extend the blade by twisting that cap. You take the casing there. So this is the halfway point, and you put the owl right in the center of the cap of the cigar. And I'm kind of looking over my microphone here, so you'll forgive me. And then you want to very, very slowly and carefully twist with this hand while pushing, and pushing with this hand. And you want to make sure that it goes through the cap and into the tobacco of the actual, the actual cigar itself, while not hurting the cap of that cigar. And then when you're done, when you reach all the way to the end, you pull it out very carefully, and you're left with a very clean cut around the edge, opening, and your cap is left inside, which pops right out when you retract it again. Now let's say that you take this cigar and it's a little too tight, and you want to open it up a little bit more, see if it can help with that. So what you would do is you would continue twisting the casing until you get all the way to the end here, and you'll know when it reaches it. Use the owl to put it, you see that hole there, right in there. You can use the owl to position it, and then you continue twisting, and again, be very careful. It's a little bit easier because you're not going through that tobacco that's closed off the cap. And you go all the way to the end, and then you pull out again. Now, sometimes there's some tobacco left over, sometimes there's not. But that will give you a slightly looser draw. Now, the interesting thing about this feature is that I prefer the draws made with the shallow cutting depth significantly more than the standard deeper cut. In fact, I ended up using the deeper cutting option only about 15% of the time, essentially only when I felt like I needed a looser draw. This means that for the vast majority of the cigars I used this cutter on, I utilized the shorter cutting depth that is one of the more unique features of the XIKAR. All right, so time to go over some good things and some bad things. The good things that I loved about this 10mm cutter from XIKAR, and some things that I think could be changed, or things that I wish necessarily weren't the case. So, starting off the good things, it's really, really great at cutting cigars. Granted, it needs to be used on smaller ring gauges, and larger ring gauges, and I'll get to that in a minute. But in terms of using it for cigars that it's actually designed for, ring gauges, let's call it 44 up to 70, 72, around there, then it works really, really well. It cuts cleanly. As long as you take your time with it, it's something that I'd never had any issues with, the cuts not being clean or anything of that nature. It is a very, very well built and well designed cutter. It does have scratches on the exterior, and I'm not surprised at that. I carried it around for a long time, so that doesn't surprise me. But they're not distracting in any way, and it's something that they don't have just major flaking or anything like that. It's definitely a well designed cutter, well built and solid. When it comes to thinking that you're not going to think that this thing is going to fall apart on you. Never have I thought that. Now, in terms of design, you have the two unique design choices that XIKAR made for the cutter. One of them is the centering owl, which I found very, very useful, and probably more so than most people, because my cuts when I'm using a punch cutter tend to be off center, and so it was useful for me to be able to tell exactly where the center was in a cigar, and put the blade into the center of the cap and push it in from there. And so for me, that was very useful. For others, perhaps not so much. The second thing is the dual cutting depths. And so this was an interesting thing for me, because the deeper depth on this cutter is actually the more standard one that you will find with most punch cutters. And I found myself utilizing the shorter cutting depth quite a bit more. About 85% of the time I use that shorter cutting depth. I only use that the deeper cutting depth basically when I needed a little bit looser draw. And so it was interesting to me the fact that you have these two options here, but one of them, the shorter cutting depth, the more unique cutting depth, is actually the one that I preferred, and the more standard cutting depth is the one that I really didn't utilize all that often. When I used it, I needed it a little bit looser draw, and it worked for that, albeit not in a very dramatic way. But most of the time, I really used the more unique shorter cutting depth on this cutter. Now, having said all of that, I did have some issues with the XIKAR, and the main one comes down to the fact that it only has one blade, and it is really best suited for medium to large ring gauge cigars, from about 44 to 70 ring gauge or so. There are other cutters, punch cutters, that are designed with multiple options. For example, the Quasar Cut has 3 different options, as you see here, and you can cut anything from a Lancero up to a very, very large ring gauge cigar here. And it also comes in at $59, which is about $5 less than the XIKAR, which is at $64.99. However, this cutter only has the one blade and the one size. And if you are smoking exclusively Lanceros or exclusively smaller ring gauge cigars, Petite Coronas, this may not be the best option for you. However, it does really, really well with the medium to larger ring gauge cigars, as I mentioned. Now, there are other minor issues. For example, the fact is that the keyring, while it is very useful, the fact that this cutter is fairly weighty means that if you attach this keyring to a existing keyring with fobs and other things on it, you're going to feel it. It's definitely something that you are not going to want to carry around very long in your pocket. Also, although it's not exclusive to this specific cutter, it's, in general, you can't cut torpedoes with a punch cutter, and this one is no different in that regard. So if you're smoking a lot of torpedoes, I would definitely look elsewhere. And so in the end, after all of that, can I recommend the XIKAR 10mm punch cutter? The answer is yes, but with a couple of caveats. Well, this is a very, very well-made cutter. It cuts cigars cleanly. It cuts them consistently. I had very little damage to the wrapper or to the cap when I was actually using it. And in addition, it's got two really nice, unique features on it that don't add any bulk or anything like that. It also has those two very useful and fairly unique product, options in one product, and that is the centering aisle, which really helped me get better centered cuts on my cigars, and the two cutting depths. I preferred the shallow depth as opposed to the more standard deeper cut, and so having both of those options when it comes to actually deciding which one you want was very, very useful, especially since it was in one product. However, it does have some limitations in the fact that it can only cut cigars medium to larger range cigars. You can't cut anything with a 44, 40, 38, anything like that. Lanceros, Petite Coronas, you're not going to be cutting those anytime soon with these, or torpedoes for that matter. If you're cutting, medium to larger range cigars consistently, and that's basically all you're smoking, this is a really good choice. However, if you are wanting to cut smaller ring gauge cigars a lot, or even, some of the time, I would definitely go with something like the Quasar Cut, which is a cutter that is, built around the idea of having the convenience to cut just about any ring gauge you want in one package, and by the way, costs about $5 less than the XIKAR. Having said all that, if you're cutting these medium to larger ring gauge cigars and you want something that's built like a tank, the XIKAR is definitely something you should take a look at. That's my opinion. For more news and reviews on premium cigars, go to halfwheel.com.